Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today, thanks to our friends over at Guns Galore of Lakeland, we got our hands on a Glock 19 Gen 5, the latest in the Glock evolution. The Gen 5s are available currently in a 19 and a 17. And before I go any further, I'll show you that we do have an unloaded gun. Let's go ahead and talk about the Gen 5 and a few of the features about the Gen 5. This is pretty much based on the FBI contract gun. The FBI had wanted a gun that met some specific characteristics. It was not a big deviation from the current Glock, so they went ahead and did that, built that gun, and this is the retail or civilian version of that. There's a few things that make the Gen 5 different. Under the hood, it fundamentally starts with a Gen 4 and then makes a few changes. One of the changes, probably the most noticeable change, is the loss of the finger grooves. Now, early Glocks didn't have finger grooves. In the middle they did. The Gen 4, of course, had the finger grooves, and now with the Gen 5, they're back to no finger grooves. As far as whether that's a good thing or a bad, it really depends on your hand. I found the finger grooves kind of fit nicely right between the fingers. They work perfectly, so I didn't have any problem with the finger grooves. Other people had them where the finger grooves would kind of bite into, a finger. They wouldn't land between the fingers like they should. They'd bite in. Without the finger grooves, with this RTF texture, which is kind of a very aggressive texture, but it doesn't hurt, it doesn't bite into your hand, but you do definitely get a good grip on it. With or without the finger grooves, I don't feel like I'm in any danger of losing control of this gun or having it slip out of my hand. So the finger grooves worked for me, but I don't miss them either, so it's kind of either way. But if the finger grooves hurt your hand, this will be a major upgrade for you. Another change they made is there's a cutout here at the front of the grip. And this conceptually is so that if you have a stuck magazine, you can reach in there with your thumb and kind of forcibly eject the magazine, kind of rip the magazine out of there. Nothing I've really actually had to do with a Glock. They do have the drop-free mags. You hit the mag release and they drop free. Conceptually, if you had one that was jammed and you needed to get it out, you can do that. A lot of the other manufacturers use lips or cutouts on the sides so you get it this way. This is kind of a little bit unusual. The disadvantage to it is, depending on your fingers, especially if you got a little extra meat on your fingers, you could get them pinched in there in that gap between the magazine and that cutout and get a pinch. Now, Hammer's got bigger hands than I do, and he did not get pinched while we were shooting this gun, and I did not get pinched either. So that's really all going to depend on your hand and how your hand works. While we're talking about that little cutout, let's talk about some minor changes they made to the magazine. One of them is you can see the foot, the base plate of the magazine, it's kind of got a little bit of a bevel in it. It's a little bit kind of rounded at the top. And here is a Gen 4 magazine, and you'll see it's kind of much more flush, so the Gen 5 sticks out a little bit further, and that's to facilitate that getting a hold of it. However, and when you see our range footage, you'll see we tried it with both magazines. A Gen 4 mag does insert and works perfectly. We ran this gun with a Gen 4 mag, a Gen 4 10-round mag, a single stack, and we ran it, of course, with the Gen 5 mags that come with it, and it ran perfectly. So the magazines are interchangeable. The other change they made is they flared the mag well. You'll see it. It's kind of hard to see it, and there's a gag. I got the light to hit it. There's a bit of a flare, and it sticks down just a little bit. It's just a little bit longer, like 0.01 inches longer, and that gives you that flare. And you can also kind of see it from the front. You see it kind of sticks out, kind of flares out like this, as opposed to coming down straight and flush. Now, depending on the size of your hand, you may end up with your pinky finger on the flare, but both Hammer and I had no problems with the flare. Conceptually, it's to make it a little bit easier to insert the magazine and not hang up. Now, that flare happens to only be on the sides. So it's not a full competition flared mag well like you'd see on some competition guns that are flared at the front and the back, but they're a little bit flared to the sides, and it's easy to get the magazine in. Of course, I had no trouble getting the magazine into the original one either. While we're on the subject of the magazines, I'm going to show you the magazines themselves. A couple minor differences. First one is most obviously is this bright orange follower, and the Gen 5 mag has the bright orange follower, and the original mags were black. And they're the same architecture. If you look at the top of them, they look the same. They've got the same features. It's just this one is orange polymer instead. And one of the things that'll do for you is I've got a magazine loaded with a couple snap caps. As you can see the orange follower more clearly in the witness holes. to get an idea roughly where your gun is loaded to. Now keep in mind, of course, the follower is going to down below where you actually have ammo in it, so this tells you that it's not loaded to 5 or not loaded to 7, it's up here. The other thing that on the magazine, I showed you this earlier, but I had the gun in my hand, so I'll try to show it to you a little bit more closely, is the base plate is a little bit bigger on the Gen 5. You'll see it kind of sticks out right here and kind of bevels forward, and if I turn it this way, you'll see that it sticks out further, and that's to facilitate that grab a hold of it and yank it out concept. But again, they work interchangeably. This Gen 5 mag works perfectly in a Gen 4 and vice versa. This doesn't hang up in any part of the frame on a Gen 4, so there's no problems using your existing stash of magazines, or if you add a Gen 5 to your collection, and pick up one of the Gen 5 mags, it's going to work fine in your Gen 4, so there's no problem there. Next thing we'll talk about is a couple of the other features on the gun. It does have an ambidextrous slide stop slide release, and that's a first for Glock on any of their versions. You can release it from either side, and it's actually pretty easy to get a hold of from either side. It is the more flush mount ones like you find on a standard Gen 4. It's not the extended, but it is actually quite easy to get a hold of. And the other thing that's different, if you look at the nose of it, it's got a beveled, somewhat rounded front to the slide. And this is something that's typical. It's been on the 26, the 27, the various subcompacts for a long time. Make it a little bit easier to slide it into a holster. But it's new to the 19 or any of the larger Glocks. And one thing you'll hear comments about, and see if I can get it to show up on camera, is that they didn't bevel the slide. So right here, there it is, you can see there's a little bitty bit of a shelf where the front of the frame, so I'm sorry, they beveled the slide, they didn't bevel the frame entirely. Now the frame is rounded at this point, but there's a little bitty visible lip there. And that does seem to bother some people. It doesn't bother me much. It's not really going to hang up. It is still rounded, you'll see. It's just one of these where you might think that it would have been better if they had kind of rounded this a little bit more. And they might have been trying to avoid weakening this area, making this thin, even though this top of the dust cover is really not a stress area. But that's one thing you'll notice, that little shelf. And the other thing you'll notice, and you can kind of notice it really from this angle, is the slide is very black, and it makes the frame look more grayish. And in the past, if you looked at a Glock, the whole thing looked black, and now because the slide is so black, it makes the frame look a little bit gray. This slide is something they call NDLC, and that's their proprietary name for it. It's similar to a black nitride coating. It's supposed to be very durable and very strong. One thing I'll show you when I get it apart, it doesn't seem to be as durable on the barrel, but in the slide it does seem to be very smooth, and we'll see how time tells as far as wear and how well it holds up. It still retains the reversible magazine release. It's not ambidextrous, but it can be reversed. And it still retains the replaceable back straps. So it comes without a back strap, and you can operate the gun with no back strap, so that would be the small. It comes with 2 other back straps in the same basic shape, medium and large, that you can attach. And it also comes with 2 beaver tails. And the beaver tail ones kind of come up along the back and then clip over this and give a noticeable 1911 style beaver tail. And it comes in a medium and a large for that as well. Now let's talk about the sights. It's got the standard Glock U-dot sights, and they are polymer. Now there is a 3-dot night sight available, and there's also another set that has a front phosphorus, kind of like a TFO style sight. I think they're Ameriglows, and you can get those from the OEM pre-installed. But the basic sights that come on it are plastic, just like the prior Glocks were. And unlike the summer special version, which we've got one of, we've got a video out on that we'll put in the description, that actually came with metal sights, this continues with the polymer sights. Now, a lot of people don't like the polymer sights, but I've never once, in all the Glocks we've had and all the abuse they've put up with, broken a polymer Glock sight. They're pretty thick, they're pretty strong, they kind of stick up and they're flat so that you can hook them on a belt, a boot, or whatever it is if you're trying to do one-handed cycling. And I've never broken one. but a lot of people want the metal sights, and you know, the Summer Special had them, but the Gen 5 didn't, and that's one of the things that's kind of surprising. Why didn't they carry that forward? Because they already had to design them and build them. Why doesn't the Gen 5 have that feature? It does have the split trigger system, which is part of the drop safety. No external safety, just like any other Glock, and a single slot Picatinny rail. Now, because Glocks have been around with this single slot Picatinny rail for a long time, the aftermarket has definitely dealt with that fact, and most aftermarket accessories come with, you know, reversible plates and things like that, and they definitely will adapt to this. There's pretty much nothing that won't make itself work on a Glock with that single rail. So you can hang lights, lasers, and everything else that you might want to hang off the bottom of this thing pretty easily. One other departure from previous versions is there's only one pin at the front for the trigger, as opposed to the two that you were used to on the Gen 4. And then of course there's a pin at the back. And this pin at the back is a dual purpose. It holds the back straps in. It comes with a slightly longer pin, but either the short pin that fits flush or the slightly longer one for the back straps also hold the fire control group and sear in. So they've got now what you could call a 2-pin arrangement instead of a 3, which is kind of interesting because they had put the 3-pin in to increase stability, and now they're going back the other way. One of the things you'll find is that the majority of the internal components, especially those involved in the fire control group, are different, so there isn't as much cross-compatibility between the versions as there was before. Dimensionally, this is a little bit bigger than a Glock 19, but not a whole lot. It's 7.28 inches long. It's 5.04 inches tall, which is 0.05 taller than a Gen 4 Glock 19. And it is just a little bit wider. It's 1.34 wide, which is a little bit wider than, it's about 0.26 wider than a Gen 4. And that accounts for the extra right here. You got the two, you know, slide stop, slide release pins on both sides now, so they stick out a little further. And the magazine flare accounts for a little bit of the height. So if you were to put this up to, and I'll do that later in the video, compare this to a couple different guns. If you put this up to a Gen 4 Glock 19, it's just a hair bigger. Not enough to make a difference, and there's good reason for the differences, you know, the flared mag well and the ambidextrous slide stop, slide release, but it is a difference. It weighs 23.99 ounces unloaded, and it holds 15 rounds, and it has a 4.02 inch barrel, which is 0.01 inches longer than the Gen 4, and that accounts for the crown, and I'll show you that when I get the gun apart and take it apart. So the next step, we'll go ahead and take this thing apart, show you the internals. So to take it apart is actually really easy. Make sure it's clear, pull the trigger, just grab a hold of it on the back like this with your thumb around the back, and then just close your hand. Pull down on the two tangs, and it slides right apart. So now that I've got the gun apart, I'm going to set the frame aside. We're going to talk about the slide a little bit, and then we'll go back and talk about the frame. So let's pop the dual recoil spring out, which this is characteristic of the Gen 4s. And the barrel. I'll set the barrel aside. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Then the rest of the slide is pretty standard through the versions. The one thing that's different is the drop safety is kind of this beveled ramp, so it's kind of oblong, and it's a ramp from the back. You can have a flat and then a ramp at the front. This is very similar to the Glock 42-43, and supposedly what this does is it makes the trigger bar less likely to hang up when trying to disengage the drop safety. It makes the trigger a little smoother. Other than that, internally this is all pretty much the same. You know, it's well machined, it's smooth. You know, the Glock does do a good job with the machining of them, but they don't do anything for aesthetics or to make it look fancy. Everything on a Glock is for pure function. So you've got the loading ramp here. This here is the edge of the striker that connects with the fire control group. A little bit of tension on it, and that's, you know, as you pull the trigger, it'll slowly tension it. When you release the trigger, it'll come forward. And the drop safety, because it's in the locked position, prevents it from going any further forward. If I push it down, then I can push it a little bit further forward, and then you'll see it clicks when I bring it back. So that's the drop safety in play, preventing the striker from protruding and hitting the primer. In fact, if I show you that, you can see right now that the striker is not protruded, and if I push on it, I can't get it out. I can't get it to come out. You can see it back there, but it won't come out towards the primer. If I push the drop safety in, then I can get it to protrude, and then when I pull it back it locks. So it is a drop safe weapon, and Glocks have been proven over the years to be very drop safe. They've done all sorts of horrible things to these and they haven't gone off. Now let's talk about the barrel a little bit. Pretty standard barrel. It's got a nice feed ramp, it's kind of wide. They're not necessarily polished feed ramps, they're kind of what you might consider machine polished. They're smooth and they work well. The Glocks are known to feed just about everything, but it's not a highly polished like you might find in some other guns. And one thing I'm noticing on this though is the finish. This gun's got less than 100 rounds through it, and you can see a definite area here where the finish is worn off, area up here at the top where it's worn off, and kind of like a curved area here at the top where it's worn off. I have the barrel here to a Gen 4 Glock 19 that's got a lot of miles on it. We've run this in a number of competitions, and if you look you can see that same basic pattern on this, but if I turn it side to the side from the light you'll see that it hasn't worn through the surface treatment. So the original Gen 4 barrel's surface treatment appears to go deeper into the metal, either that or be stronger than the Gen 5, despite the slide hitting it in the same areas. So that's one thing that we'll see, time will tell, but this Gen 4 has gone through a number of competitions, quite a few visits to the range, trained quite a few newbie shooters, so there's a lot of rounds through this, and again, less than 100 through this, and already, the finish, the surface treatment is worn through in several areas. The barrel, see if I can get it turned just right, you'll see on the Gen 5, which is this one here, the barrel has a bit of a crown. And this is part of the Glock match barrel. The Gen 5s have what's called a Glock match barrel, and that's missing from the Gen 4. Allegedly, the Glock match barrel makes the gun more accurate, but again, all pistols pretty much are as accurate as the hand that's holding them at the ranges they're intended to be used at. And actually, I misspoke. It's the Glock Marksman barrel, not match barrel. So GMB is the abbreviation, but it's the Glock Marksman barrel. Let's go ahead and put this thing back together and set aside that Gen 4 barrel. We don't need that anymore. Drop the barrel back in place, drop the spring back in place, and you have a reassembled slide. And the slide's actually very easy to put together. So let's go ahead now and look at the frame. The frame doesn't really look visibly different than any of the others, with the exception of this little hook at the front of the sear. And that's reminiscent of what they've done with the 42 and 43, whereas the sear on a Gen 4 is smoother. It doesn't have that extra hook at the front. And I did mention, and it is true, that there's differences in all these components. The trigger bar and everything else is somewhat different. And here you can also see the ambidextrous slide stop slide release, and it's actually kind of a semi-U shaped, so it comes along here, goes around back through pivots and comes back up, and it's pretty robust metal. So unlike a few of the guns that have tried out the whole ambidextrous slide stop slide release where the one doesn't work well because it just bends, this one does work well. It'll work from either side, it works reliably, and the whole arm assembly is quite strong. And at the front you've got the locking block, the front guides, and the rear guides. Overall, it's, again, nothing fancy. There's nothing in here that doesn't, purely perform a function, but everything in here is well machined and does its function quite well. Putting it back together is also quite easy. You just take the slide and line up. Oops, it helps if you turn it the right way. Line it up with the guides to the back. Slide it all the way back. Lock it back. You can lock it back or you can just cycle it. Function test, and you're back in business. So you're back up and running. So overall, as far as a pistol goes, it's a very well manufactured, it's a well done pistol. If you're happy to see the demise of the finger grooves, then this would be a good choice for you. When we were shooting at this at the range from a behavioral standpoint, we noticed two things. One, the trigger it's somewhat lighter. It's only a couple ounces lighter than a standard Gen 4, and it's a little bit on the creepy side. Now I'm pulling back on it, I'm not really getting a wall, and then it breaks. What I noticed is it was somewhat vague. So I'm pulling back, and then it broke. I really had no idea when it was going to break, and I'll show you the reset. It has that same pretty short block reset, because that would be all the way out. I'll pull it again, Now, the reset's right there, and it bounced just a little bit. But one of the things I noticed, and you are right on the edge, and you're able to start bringing it back and break. The big difference I noticed between this and the prior trigger is the lack of a wall. It just kind of trigger pulls the whole way, and you go through the take-up, and then you start to have, you go through the take-up, and you start to have tension, and it just kind of creeps its way through, and then finally breaks. It's smooth, but it's very vague. And that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, is entirely a matter of opinion. Some people don't like the distinct wall. That makes it feel like the trigger's heavier. Some people, really like a nice kind of a smooth and really don't mind a creepy trigger. My preference is for that distinct sharp wall, because once you're on that wall, it's only fractions of an inch of quick pull and it breaks. So when I first took this to the range, I was having a hard time getting good groups with it, not because of any defect in the pistol, but because the vagueness of the trigger was, I wasn't able to figure out exactly where it was going to break, so I was starting to overthink it. Got used to that and was able to shoot it quite well and get nice tight groups with it. But that is one of the difference. You'll hear the trigger is lighter. It is, just a little bit. But it does turn into a more vague, slightly creepy trigger as opposed to the very distinct sharp wall that you had on the prior versions. The only other thing we experienced with this, and I've seen this on some other people's video, is weak ejection. The round would just kind of just pop out and just casually fall away from the gun. I had a few of them land on my arm and my hand, which no Glock that I've ever had before ever did that, and actually had one come back and land on my shoulder and roll up against my neck. It's been my experience with Glocks in the past that they're in a hurry to get rid of the spent round, and they usually make the guy in the lane next to you think it's raining brass because it shoots him over the wall. This one doesn't do that. Now, we were using UMC white box, which is not the most powerful ammo on the planet, and when we were testing with some of our other Glocks, they weren't throwing it as far as they normally would, but they were still getting it further out than this. And even when we tried this with the Federal HST, which is a pretty hot defense ammo, the ejection pattern was fairly weak. Now, typically you would equate a weak ejection pattern with the likelihood of failure to eject, jams, stovepipes, and stuff like that. We had none of that. The gun just worked. So despite that slightly weaker ejection pattern, it did run. We had no hang-ups, not a single hang-up from round one till we were done with it. So time will tell if that's actually really a problem. If the springs, when they loosen up a little bit with some rounds through it, it'll continue to eject, or is it something that they changed in the format of the ejector that's causing that? Whatever it is, it's noticeable, but it didn't cause any malfunction whatsoever. So that would lead you to the question, should I get a Gen 5? Well, if you don't like the finger grooves on the prior ones, then that definitely would be something you might want to consider, the Gen 5. Otherwise, if you've got Gen 4s and they work, I don't see any good reason to kick them to the curb, unless of course you're a lefty and would like that ambidextrous slide stop, because to the best of my knowledge, there's no way to retrofit an earlier one. They actually had to cut a notch in the side. If you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, check us out on Facebook, and have a great day. Thank you.
Anyone ever tries to break into our house, I bet.
Okay. What?